G'day everybody and welcome to another episode of Automotive Carnage. In today's episode, we're going to get cracking back into the 1979 Toyota Cressida, the bush car from the bush. Let's get into it. G'day everybody, my name's DJ and thank you for joining me on this episode of Automotive Carnage. Now a whole bunch of you have been asking for it, the other half of you don't know what it is. This is the 1979 Toyota Cressida, the bush car from the bush. Now as you know, we go out bushwreck hunting here in the outback for all sorts of vehicles, mainly Holdens, Fords, Valiants, but every now and then we do come across a gem that may be Japanese or maybe European. And what I wanted to do was see if I can make one of these things work and use it as a bush car at the abandoned speedway track. There is an old speedway track that used to be used back in the 80s, 70s, 80s and early 90s that's no longer being used except for a few of us locals who know where it is. And I wanted to build a car using only parts that I find in the bush to go race at this raceway track, plus the other hundreds of kilometers of abandoned old mining tracks and everything that are around this area. So the idea was I had to find a car in the bush and build it using only parts recycled from other wrecks around. Now the first thing I did was went out and found a reliable drivetrain that would actually work, and a friend of mine had a 2003 BA Fairmont sitting in their backyard, a G220, so it had the 5.4 litre V8 4-speed automatic, and she ended up blowing the torque converter in that by doing too many neutral drops and too many burnouts. So I ended up picking that up for 500 bucks for the entire car. And that had been sitting in her backyard for a good 6 to 8 months, I think it was, before I got it. So technically, although not found in the bush, at least it was a complete car, complete running. I won't say driving because the torque converter was blowing up. And that was the base for our idea. Now, we had an engine, we had a drive line, we had to go find a body to put it into. And this is where the whole bush wrecking of my channel came from. Originally, I just wanted to find something that would fit this big 90-degree V8 between its strut tails. Now ideally I was looking for Fords. It's a Ford engine, I wanted to put into a Ford body, but all their strut tails were way too narrow. So then we moved on to Holdens. I absolutely love the shape of the HQ Holden, but at that time I couldn't find any good enough bodies around, even HJs, HZs, all that kind of stuff. They would fit it, they would fit the engine, but the bodies were just not good enough to work with. They had B pillars chopped out, they had roofs chopped off, all sorts of weird and wonderful things going on there. So then it just came a free-for-all. It's like, okay, I will take any car I can that's complete that will fit the engine in it. And I remember about this Toyota that I found many years ago. And so we went around, measured it up, and sure enough, it was the V was going to fit within the strut towers. It was going to fit long-wise. It was awesome. So Dad and I went back out, we rescued the vehicle, and as we were pulling into town, some hilarity ensued because at that time we didn't have a car trailer or anything reliable to move a vehicle with, so we just towed it into town. It was only 5 kilometers outside of town, and we're going past our airport and the front wheel went that way and my car went that way as I'm being towed by Dad. So that was interesting. Anyway, we managed to fix it up, got it back into town, and started pulling out the old 2.6 litre straight six that was still in it. Unfortunately that motor was completely seized. There was no point in trying to work with it, so we ripped it out. I listed it up for free parts for a while there, just to make sure if anyone needed anything, they could grab it. No one wanted anything, so over to the rubbish dump that went. Then we started the task of fitting this monster of an engine with the help of some very smart friends and Dave coming around and giving me a hand to actually make the mounts and all that. We managed to get it in there, and quite surprisingly, that engine just went shtuk, and it just fitted. It was wonderful. Didn't have to bash the trans tunnel at all for the transmission. There's plenty of room to fit the radio at the front. It just went shadunk, and also the factory Ford engine mounts lined up with the cross member where the Toyota chassis mounts were, engine mounts were, which was absolutely amazing. So a little bit of fiddling around with all that, and we managed to get it all to work. Custom mounts in between the block and the chassis, and we're all good. She's sitting in there nice now. Had a bit of trouble with a trans cross member, but I've gone and fixed that up now anyway, so it's sitting in its final resting place. But it does need to come out again because we need to get a torque converter, and we need to get some flanges made up, CNC flanges made up, and a few other bits and pieces I can't recall right now. So anyway, moving on to the rest of the vehicle. When we put the V8 in there, one thing we did have to do was take the original steering box out because it was fouling on one of the heads, and there was no way we were going to be able to build an exhaust manifolds off of it. So we had to rip out the original steering box and the idler arms and all the control arms, and we ended up finding a VB VC Commodore with a manual rack and pinion. So we pulled that out of there, and we managed to weld up brackets, and that now this car runs a full rack and pinion system. It's got the steering column is half Toyota, half Holden, and then the actual rack itself and tie rod ends, they're all Holden as well. So now we have a rack and pinion steering in it, and there's plenty of room to fit the exhaust on this side and the starter motor on the other side where the idler arm used to go. What else have we done? We've fabbed up, mounts for the radiator using Kia Sorento radiator mounts, I think it is, Kia Carnival, sorry, the minivan. We've also relocated the battery tray from that side over to this side. Reason being was I was originally going to use the factory Fairmont wiring loom. And so I had like a mount here where I put the factory fuse box and everything. But it was just too much of a mess for me to try to work out. I am not very good with wiring at all, and with everything else I'm trying to learn and trying to fab up at the same time, wiring was just too much. So I got hold of Bill Hooton, who was probably the best Barra computer tuner and programmer and wiring loom maker there is in Australia. And he's like, I actually love the idea of your build, and so he helped us out. And he chipped the factory PCM and made a wiring harness and fuse box and everything I need to make this engine run, just using start switch and on switches and stuff like that. So please don't steal my car when it's going, because there's going to be no security in the PCM. So battery is okay over to this side. Also, that allows for intake, the factory intake to still be used, so that goes over that way behind the passenger side headlight. I think that is all the modification I have done, a major modification I've done in the engine bay so far. We've chopped out lots of metal at the front to make the radiator fit further forward, just because we had we had heaps of room, but there was like one plug that kept fouling on the head and for the fans, and I cut so much metal out just to get that radiator forward, like a couple of mil, so that plug wouldn't foul anymore. But anyway, that's that done. So I think that is all the work done in the engine bay so far. Let's move on to the interior. Now, before I get too in depth on the interior here and what we've done, I want to address, I guess, the elephant in the room, and that is I've already mentioned a bunch of brand new parts. But wait, you're thinking, you said this was a bush car from the bush, and yes, well, it is. The original criteria was that I have to source parts that I need from the bush. If I can't source them, I have to custom make them. If I can't custom make them, then I can go buy brand new parts. But that's a very last ditch effort. The only exception to that rule was the fuel system and the brakes. I don't want to catch on fire, and I want this car to stop. So they are all completely and utterly brand new fuel system, brand new brakes, discs, rotors, all that kind of stuff. So just a little bit of safety gear there. So in the case of getting Bill to do the PCM, it's still using the factory and original wiring harness and PCM from the Fairmont that donated the engine. We just had to customize it. But I chose to get someone who knows what they're doing to customize it, so I don't fry the circuitry or blow something up or just break it, because wiring just goes way over my head. What I'm excited about this build is all the fabrication I'm learning and how to make things work that shouldn't work together, i.e. the steering column, the fuel system, the engine mounts, all that kind of stuff. It's a whole new experience for me, and this car really is testing the limits of my knowledge, hence why it's taking so long, because I need to get out of my own head when I'm building it and stop telling myself I don't know how to do it and just figure out a way to do it. So that's been a real mental kind of game with this car. So now we're getting back into it. Anyway, the interior. These are not the factory seats. We found these seats in a abandoned NC Fairlane, 5-litre Windsor. Well, actually 5 litres still sitting out in the bush. I should go get that. I didn't know my NCs at that point. I thought these were like a factory sports pack option. It turns out they're actually aftermarket Recaros from the 90s. Most likely out of a little 2-door Mazda or Toyota or something like that. So really cool seats, and I'm really glad that we're able to find them. Not like find them in the bush, which is amazing, but also make them fit using the factory Toyota rails. So a little bit of custom work there to make those all work. Now also, this generation of Barra motors is fly-by-wire throttle control, or electronic throttle control, whatever you want to call it, drive-by-wire. So we do have the original Fairmont pedal that's mounted up down in the footwell there. And what's really cool about the Fairmont is it actually has a feature where you're able to adjust the pedals in and out. So I've kept that motor on there so that depending on who's driving, or pretty much to save me a whole bunch of fabrication and trying to set the pedal in the right position, we can just adjust it as it is. And we're going to use the original aerial switch to adjust that in and out. And I think that is pretty much it for the interior. I do have some cool old sports wheels I've found in the bush, but I haven't found one that fits the spline yet. And I haven't, also you're not going to find the Boss kit out here. That's just something that's a bit ridiculous to try to find one of those. We need to make a better mount than what I've done for the gear selector. Yeah, that's all for the interior. Let's move to the boot and show you the fuel system. Okay, so there's not too much going on back here, so we'll make it quick. We lift the inspection cover and we find the Ford Fairmont fuel pump. Yes, this still retains its factory Toyota Cressida fuel tank. We're able to cut a larger hole, and the fuel pump from the Fairmont fitted in there absolutely perfectly. So, brand new clips, brand new rubber hosing. For now, we're using the Toyota Cressida hard lines. Whether they're going to be a large enough diameter or not, we'll find out once we start running the vehicle and seeing if it has any fueling issues. But yeah, there we go. We managed to retrofit the newer 2003 fuel system and fuel pump and all that units into the original tank, which one of the parts of this car that I'm really chuffed about. Nice side note, these tanks do have a bung on the bottom, but someone decided that was too easy, I guess, or too hard to undo to drain the fuel, and so they put an axe in the side of the fuel tank, so we had to weld that up as well, which is kind of interesting. Okay, and then the last major component that we have done, and a lot of it was done off camera, is the rear end. Now, last time I did any major filming on this car, it was sitting in this carport, facing the other way, with the rear end up on axle stands and absolutely no rear end or no diff in this vehicle. Now, reason being, the new V8 has got 220 kilowatts at the crank from the factory. The factory 2.6 litre inline 6 makes about 80 kilowatts from the factory. So the tiny little Toyota E-Series diff that was in here, open wheeler, I feel was not going to handle the power. So I didn't want to waste time getting a custom drive shaft ordered. Again, we're really not going to find a drive shaft out here that's going to fit from a Ford to a Toyota diff. That's just not logical. So we're going to get one of those custom made. But I didn't want to waste time building that for a diff that most likely is not going to handle the sudden increase in power and abuse. So we went out bush again. We found 2003, I think it was 2003, 2004 Toyota Hilux 4-wheel drive that had a factory LSD in it. Now it's in here. Now this is where those mental games and me getting out of my own head saying that I don't know how to do it really took off, because I have never taken a leaf sprung rear end axle, diff axle housing, and converted it to coil sprung like the car is. And that took a lot of time to figure out how it's all done. And luckily I went on a trip over to Brisbane, caught up with my uncle who's been building speedway cars since he was very young. And he's like, why don't you just do this, 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 and this? I'm like, that makes perfect sense. So now here's my first port and call of like, hey uncle, how do I do this? And he has so many great ideas and just old school hot rolling techniques. So with his help and a lot of time just nutting it out, we managed to get the 2003 Toyota Hilux diff into our car. So we've gone from a diff here that was like the size of my hand, if that, to now I think these are 8 3/4 inch. So it is big, it's beefy, and Hilux diffs have been used for years in modified cars with huge power. As I said, factory LSD, and I think the gearing is about 4.3. So this thing is going to take off from the line like a bat out of hell with that much power and such a high gearing in it. It's going to be awesome. And exactly what we need, because we don't need top speed out in the bush. We just need to accelerate very quickly up the old dirt tracks and around the speedway oval. Now I think with that, you're caught up with everything that I have done so far on this car. Next step and what we need to focus on today is finishing off mounting this rear diff. Now, I had to get it done very quickly so that I could get the Dodge 106C Ute into here and start working on that. And so when I slapped this all together, I did it so that it was pretty much so I could roll the car out of here. And so we've got springs mounted, we've got all the radius arms, control arms, I don't know what they're called, you know, the links. They're all mounted and holding it in, but the shocks need to be mounted and the panhard bar needs to be mounted. So I want to start there so that this car stops doing this. It kind of shakes around a lot on its own accord. To do that, we need to go shopping for some shocks, which I've already done that, and we need to chop up the original panhard bar. So let's get into some actual work. Rightio, so here's the plan. We're going to tackle the rear shocks first. Now, over the last couple of months, every time I go out bush or go to the rubbish dump and I find a rear shock that's the right configuration, has an eyelet at the bottom and a post at the top, I'll rip it out and measure it up against the factory one to see if it will be useful for our application or not. I don't want to use the factory shocks because they're original Toyota items. I dare say they have never been replaced in this car's life. So I want to change that for something a bit more modern and something that if we go to upgrade in the future, we can easily access. So one that I found here, the biggest, they're all in order. This is our factory Toyota here. This is our Toyota Tarago that we found, which is just way too big, unfortunately. And then the other two are our VT VX Commodores, the short one being out of a station wagon, and that one coming out of the sedan. That one specifically came out of a WH LS1 Statesman. Looking at our options that we have here, I really like the idea of running a Commodore shock. Again, easy to get new ones when it comes time to upgrade. So I found out that KYB actually have a really cool feature on their website where you type in the measurements of your shock and it will give you a listing of all the shocks around it that are a similar size that have the correct mounts on either end. So that was really, really helpful in narrowing it down to looking for exact vehicles that I needed. Now, ideally what I need is a VT VX VY VZ rear shock that has been shortened. Unfortunately, there's none of those out here. Everything that I can find around my area is all standard, which means there's an extra 20-30 mil longer. So if it was shortened, it would be almost exactly right to the standard Toyota shock. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to run the sedan ones. They are the closest fit, the closest length, I should say, and they're going to fit pretty nicely. So how are we going to mount them? Now, the wheel's already been invented, so let's not reinvent it ourselves. This is the factory trading arm that came off the Cressida. As you can see, trading arm mounts in here, and then it's just got a big 10mm bit of plate steel with a post on it, and that holds the bottom of the shock. We have just a single post on top, so we know that the top mount is exactly perfect, a fit. In fact, I've actually got one bolted into the car right now, and it's not a problem. So we need to recreate this system here. I don't have any 10mm plate lying around, but what I do have is a part of a heavy-duty pallet racking system. So what we're going to do is we're interested in this cross-section here. We'll cut it down here so we keep the bend in there for a bit of added strength, because at this end it's 6mm and at this end it's 10mm, so it's slightly tapered, but that's not going to worry us all too much. So we'll cut it down here, cut it to the appropriate length, drill a hole, and then we'll weld it to our new trading arm boxes. That's the ferry. Let's start cutting and see what happens. So here we go, this is what we've ended up with. Got to use my new 230mm grinder there. I got that to chop up cars and what have you, so keep an eye out for that in future episodes. But before I wanted to test it out and see how I cut through this thick sort of, what's that, 6mm, 7mm steel, and it did really, really well. So I caught my pants on fire, but didn't catch anything else on fire, so I'm proud of myself. Anyway, pretty simple. That's for left hand side, that's going to go like that. Bolts through there. I end up having to use my step drill bits. I don't have a 14mm single drill bit, so that was a little bit complicated, but we got there, and then eventually this is what we end up with, and then this will be welded onto the bottom trailing arm, and there we go. So I'm going to get under there now, tack those on. And then we'll have to, then we've got to sort the panhard bar, and we'll do that next. So I'll take those on, and then we'll start chopping up the panhard bar mounting system off the old diff. Yeah, let's do it. Well, that's well earned. So, the panhard bar is now mounted, the rear shocks are now mounted, and I do apologise for not filming too much there of the actual fabrication side of things. But as I said, this car and what I'm doing to it is the next step in my learning curve, pretty much. So everything I'm doing is a challenge. I've never done it before, and so I kind of just, once I start getting into how to fabricate the panhard bar, I just kind of forgot to hit record on the camera. But anyway, it's all in. So let me describe what we did. We got a bit of box tubing like this, a box section, and effectively we just put a big hole saw through here, which is the same diameter as the axle housing, and then the actual post for the panhard bar, if you can imagine, is now sitting here. So we took the original post, trimmed it down, and then wrapped it around this end, welded it on, and then, as I said, yeah, drilled this and then started notching it and creating all the curves so that it fits around all the complex angles that are underneath in the actual housing there. So this was the first one. We didn't quite get it right because there's a depth change between this curve and this curve, and I got around the wrong way, so which means that the box section that came off, excuse me, was the correct way, so we just cut that. So we learned a lot from that one. That didn't work. So let's jump underneath this car now, and I'll show you exactly what we've done. So starting on the left-hand side here, you can see our orange bit of pallet shelving there. It's just a little post, getting the right angle and everything. Well, I didn't measure it, I just kind of slapped it in there where it looks good. The actual tube is a bit close to the axle housing, but we'll see what happens. We might have to space this out a little bit, but the factory Commodore eyelets actually have a little bit of spacing on each side, which worked out really, really well. Coming over to the right-hand side, same thing here. We just kind of guesstimated and rule of thumbs to make sure that where this sits is roughly the same as where it sits on the left-hand side, and that's going to do well. And then this is the, as I said, the panhard bar mounting point. So you can see we've got our square tubing here, and then we've cut down, trimmed, and wrapped around the original one off the E-series diff, and it works out really well. So all in all, I'm really chuffed with that. Learned heaps again about fabrication and how to mount a diff in a car that's not meant to be in there. So next time I go to do it, I'll know what I'm doing, and it'll be done a whole lot quicker. Now all it's left to do is to take the diff out and then fully weld up all of those new parts that we've just put in there, making sure they're nice and strong and not going to snap off on us anytime soon. So that's not all that interesting, so I'll do that off camera. And then next week we'll dive into the engine bay. We need to pull the engine out, and we need to start making clearance so the starter motor can fit in. Currently, trying to mount it, it hits on the chassis rail, so we've got to notch part of the chassis rail out. We need to organize CNC machined flanges for the exhaust. Unfortunately, the original ones are cast iron and they're all individual ports. And so I just, for ease, I need to get some custom flanges made up. There is one company in the States who sell a flange for this engine. They are different to the Boss engines. They have a oval port, whereas the Boss has a square port, I think, or vice versa. And so the flanges you can get for really cheap for a Boss motor don't fit this single cam motor. So yeah, there's one company in the States who do it, and they want $100 US per flange, which is absolutely ridiculous. I'd rather, if I'm going to pay that, I'd rather pay an Australian company to make it for me. And then from that, we need to find enough steel headers and exhausts in the rubbish dump to then go and make our own exhaust system off it. So that will be next video's head scratcher. Until then, thank you all for watching, and yeah, we'll see you on the next episode of Automotive Carnage. See you later.